One of the core foundations of understanding functional family therapy and understanding how to successfully intervene with very difficult families is how you look at the family and how you look at the problem. The youth that we serve come from a wide variety of referral sources. Some come from child welfare, juvenile justice, mental health, or school referrals. And it's really easy sometimes to begin to try to understand the youth's behavior first within the silo in which they've been referred. For example, children, adolescents, youth from the child welfare system tend to be seen as having trauma and be struggling with past experiences with families that haven't worked out well. Kids in the juvenile justice system are also often seen as behaviorally problematic. And those in the mental health system are seen with a wide variety of both internalizing and externalizing problems. And in school, much of the focus is on academic behavior. What's really interesting, however, is that despite wherever the youth may come from that we work with, the kids that we work with are all very much the same. And they're very much the same not because they come from the same families, not because they come from the same culture, or not even because they have the same problem. But the youth that we serve are very much the same because behind each of them is a family. And that family is a unit of relationships that has the potential to be both helpful, or it is the forum in which, and so to speak, the forum in which they may fight and they may struggle every day. And it's within that context of the family that the behaviors that FFT is focused on, changing the drug using, changing the behavior, the disruptive behaviors of the youth, the internalizing struggle of the adolescent, that while it's our main target, it's got to be contextualized within the notion in the system in which it comes from. In this case, it's the family. Now, the family plays a really important role in the work that we do. And you're going to see, and you would expect that given this is a family-based and a family therapy-based approach. But if you think about it, the behaviors that that are referred to us, the behaviors that we are being asked to help change, the behaviors typically of the youth, are behaviors that fit into a context. And in this particular case, that context is a relational context. And what's important to remember is that families don't cause problems, but they can, by how they work, either become risk factors or protective factors that kind of fit within the development of and that fit within the maintenance of mental health problems, behavior problems. Families are also a really key factor in helping do treatment because without a family, it's very difficult to engage youth in treatment. It's very difficult to have successful change that goes just beyond the youth. And it's really hard to keep relapses from occurring because it's that social situation that can, over time, despite all the good changes that a youth may make, help pull them back to that more static place. Families are a system in a sense, and a systems approach in terms of thinking about the family is something that recently in the literature has become very useful in terms of understanding how families work. So for FFT, families are the core, and families really have the potential to both support, maintain problems, and at the same time, they have a tremendous potential to absorb and redirect many of the experiences of youth. It's the interactions between family members that let you know that they can engage with other people. It's interactions between family members that help youth get better. And these become healing interactions. They're not necessarily therapeutic in the sense that we might think about, but they're healing in the sense that every day when working out daily problems goes well, that the patterns, the meaning, and the connection that families and youth feel improves. The difficulty is it's not always easy to see the family in the youth's bad behavior. And in the situation we're in, we most often get youth referred to us for problematic behavior. So very much behind the behavior of the youth is something else. And it's that place behind the behavior that FFT focuses. And very much like these figure ground images that you see here on the screen, it's very difficult to know what to focus on in terms of how to best understand that behavior so that we can be helpful. In many ways, that's what much of the literature recently has been about in terms of thinking about families as a system. It's a structure to help understand. It is based on a thing called systems theory and systems models that in the early 1960s and 70s became very popular. And for some, they have kind of evolved into more of the narrative and postmodern ideas of now. However, there's some very new ideas about how to think about families as systems that have been written in some recent publications. And actually, in Adaptware, that's what you're going to be reading along with this video. In a sense, family systems thinks about families as a web of relationships, very much like a spider web where each thing is connected. And one of the reasons the spider web is a really useful analogy is because because you've been caught in them, that as you try to move through one part of the web, all the other components of the web move. So it is as if they are inexorably tied to one another, and as one moves, the other does. The idea of a web has been in the history of systems thinking, also turned into engineering and feedback loops, and into, from Bronfenbrenner, different levels of how people are involved and how interpersonal and intrapersonal behavior fits into micro, macro, and meso different levels of systems. At the end of the day, what's important to remember is this: the youth that we're working with are connected through relationships with all of the other people in their world. Now, what's important about that is these connections don't go away, and one part of them can't change without the other. So they are interconnected in all things, which means to get the youth in the center to change, it may be important to get other people to change as well. Now, it's very easy to think of the youth as our focus of attention, and it's not so hard to remember that that youth is connected to biological and that kind of core sense of family that's next to them. Now, family doesn't have to be biological. It can be a foster family. It is that core central set of psychosocial relationships that every day, that's the relationships within which the youth's behavior is situated. That's the relational context. But we also know that around those relationships, that core set, are other extended family relationships. And we even know that those relationships are embedded in a larger system, whether you call that the ecosystemic system or the larger group of peer, community, social, and even further extended family. And it's as if that family relational system is sandwiched in between culture, context, and community. For an FFT to work, we need to find a way to pull out the focus and not forget the context, but for at least the beginning to pull out the focus on that core family relational system. Now, to do that, one of the things that's really important is to remember within systems what it is we're looking for, because it isn't like we're looking for the cause of things. Because cause has to do with something that's occurred. That's about history. That's about context. Really isn't about how the family system works. Instead, we have to look at how the family works around particular problems, how the system functions in that sense. Now, to do this, it's back to the old kind of struggle between this thing in family therapy and in psychology you've heard a lot, which is the struggle between process and content. Content is the what. It may be the details of the case, it may be the history of the case, it may be the family history or the psychosocial history. It is the details, or in some sense, the weeds, the fine-tuned details. On the other side of the coin is the relational process within which those details fit. This is more of the how, that's the background to the context and the content. What I mean by that, it's the background and it gives meaning and richness and an understanding to the content of what happened. Process is about the how, and it's about the repetitive patterns that families use that are very hard to see because much like the figure ground relationship pictures that I showed you a minute ago, they're behind the thing that sticks out in the foreground, which is the content. Now, what that means is if we're going to be able to be successful with families in a long-term way, we need to focus on the part about the system and how that system works. So in this particular case, this thing we call the process or the relational system really fits in the space between people. And in that space, there are patterns, there's meaning, there's emotion, there's connection, there's different features and factors that go in, and they're different with different families. But they do have a core set of dimensions that we're able to understand. Meaning, how they're attached, what the patterns might be. So what's nice is that this process part, or the things that go on in the relational system, is where assessment and understanding. This is where we could focus our attention so we could look across problems or across content. This is also where intervention can occur. But it's important to remember we can't forget the context. It's just the details and the context need to be in the background. Now, the other thing that's really important to remember is this big system is sandwiched in between, so to speak, culture and context. And that's one of the core things about thinking of a family as a system is remembering that behaviors have their meaning because of the context in which they fit. And in particular, culture becomes one of those contexts that has to be considered when you look at a family. So culture specific factors, they have to do with what's a good organization of a family, what happens at different developmental stages, what level of emotional kind of psychological closeness or conflict resolution or even parenting style are appropriate to apply to youth. So none of these features, parenting style, closeness, or developmental stage, or even the way in which the family is organized, is universal. It is a part of a cultural context that gives norms and expectations, and therefore helps us determine what's within and out of bounds for the culture. But remember, cultural and context is not just where the family's from. Every family has its own unique culture, its own particular way in which they go about things. Now, culture and context is the spot within which the symptoms that we work with and the family system exist. So, from our perspective, what's important to do is understanding what that family system that's caught within that cultural and the contextual meaning. Now, family systems have been really difficult to understand in a sense, and because they're hard to see, it's hard to understand how to make good sense of them. But they are patterns of behavior. They're the round and around things that go on in families that seem to reoccur over and over. But within a family relational system, there's far more. Those patterns have characteristics that we can pay attention to. And there's three fundamental ones that people that are writing about systems theory and families are talking about. The first, on the left, are the patterns themselves. This is when so-and-so does something, someone else does something, which is followed by something else. What's interesting about relational systems is those patterns tend to be recurring and relatively stable. So what that means is that when they have to solve a problem, they have a similar pattern. And when they have to fix a conflict, they have a similar pattern. Secondly, the family system is also made up of the meanings that people put on those patterns. And what's interesting is that we call them in functional family therapy problem definitions in the sense that it is the meaning part which gives the emotional connection to the behavior pattern. And that can be different for each person. But that's what gives color and richness, and that's what helps you understand the emotion sometimes behind behavioral patterns that from your perspective might not be you might have a different perspective, but from someone else's, they may have a large emotional response. And that's because the meaning of that behavior is different for them. Then thirdly, family relational systems are marked by this notion of attachment. And all of us are familiar with the notion of different attachment styles. But the idea here in family systems is that families are not random, but they become very stable over time. And they become stable over time because they develop a glue, a familiarity, a kind of a safety zone and comfort zone within which they operate. Now, it doesn't mean that they only operate in one way and at one emotional level, but in different contexts, they tend to have a feeling and a connection between them. Now, what's interesting is over time, for the family members, what disappears into the background are the meanings they put on things. What disappears into the background are the relational patterns. And what happens is the feeling or the functional attachment, the kind of emotional sense you get out of going through something with a family member, where you feel a particular level of closeness or distance from them. It is that tends to move into the foreground. Now, there's one more part of family systems that's really important to understand, and that is the role of history and context. Now, I've already talked a bit about how culture can become context. We know about how community can become context. But the other part is much of where the meaning in families comes from the history that's occurred. And that history gives the members of the family system, they pull different parts and they bring different histories to the table, which may predispose them to act and give meaning to things within a behavior pattern that they've seen before. For example, trauma is a very good example. Trauma is a historical factor that family members may bring to the table. And when they bring it to the table and then experience something in a relational pattern, it is that history that helps give meaning to them. In this particular case, it's meaning related more to history than it is to actually what's going on. In addition, Functional attachments may be something that people are pre-inclined to and promote. In family systems, it is not only important to think about history and context, but perspective. Things have a meaning because of who perceives them. So the very same behavior in a family is going to be perceived by the caretaker, by the other caretaker, and the adolescent in potentially very different ways. And frequently, as we'll talk about all through this course, perspective is about the meaning that gets given, and it has three components. Actually, the definition, meaning what is the problem or what's the event, why is it important, and kind of ideas what should be done. But that sort of cognitive process also generates a set of emotions, things defined as a positive thing are reacted to in positive ways. And that promotes then softer, more relationally focused behaviors as well. So when behaviors occur when you're working, remember thinking from a family systems perspective is to think that each reaction and each perspective is equally valid. Now, the other part we'll talk about as we go through is how stable these systems become. And it's important to remember that, as I said earlier, families remember the emotional things that go on rather than the details of the pattern. And it is if below the surface of the iceberg, so to speak, is this kind of safety, comfort, sort of familiarity in terms of how they're attached. And we'll talk far more about it, but this is the relational glue, and it's the style in which it's the color, it's the richness, it's the feeling in which the patterns and the meaning are connected. And that has a function, these patterns and this attachment has an individual function for each family member. Each family member walks away with a particular functional outcome, something in which, while it may not be positive, it still could be familiar. It is here in which stability happens, and the term that's frequently used in family systems, which is called homeostasis, occurs. Families tend to stay the same, not just because they have stable patterns, but because those patterns get glued together around relational functions. Now, all this leads us to a discussion then about what's important as therapists, because we come to a family system having to focus on how to change it. So the idea would be how, from a process family systems perspective, can you think about problems? And you will see this throughout the course where we talk about the fact, and we do it in a very simple way. This family system has come into something that has become and really challenged it and has become part of the family. And it isn't, they're working in very similar ways. It's just the outcome is very negative and they're very stuck. And they're stuck in the different parts of the family system, the patterns. They're stuck in the differences in the meaning of what they're struggling with and in functions. Now remember, it's really hard not just for you, but it's hard for family members to see the family part. Because remember the notion of perspective. From their perspective, they see what they see, and that's what's important. So remember, family members are not always going to see the same thing that you do. In fact, quite differently. What they need is not for you to show them and tell you how they work. From a family systems perspective, what a family needs is for you to focus on, by the time they come to you, remembering there's a long history, acknowledging the built-up frustration, and the good intentions and attempts that both the youth and caregivers take. They don't feel understood, so what they need is to be understood, and they need a way out that helps them in the way in which they're organized, do something that's important to them that helps them work things out on an everyday basis. What do they need? They need you to purposefully guide them, help them keep focused on the immediate, not on the past, help them keep focused on the process, not the content. Focus on them working together because in there is the power to solve things. And focus on understanding now, not because of history, and learning new ways to change behavior patterns to work things out every day. And that's what FFT brings, are relational goals that follow a change process that help engage a family, teach them, and help them to maintain. And what the family needs you to do in the discussions along the way by taking a family systemic approach is to be purposeful guiding and look for opportunities to discuss these issues. And to do that, it means you have to lead the system because left to its own devices, it'll stay pretty static. So what can you do? These ideas of family systems provide a wonderful kind of window into how to be a good treatment person. Why not take the meaning part and use reframing and interrupt? Why not take the behavioral part and implement new sets of skills? Why not take the attachment and instead of changing that attachment style, we would match to it so that the family felt like it was in their comfort zone, all that we were doing. And we would take account in history and context. The focus to help families most is on a process focus where we make individual and cultural adaptations along the way. What families need and what therapy is not about magic, but it's about using the right skills at the right time and mapping the FFT treatment map on how family systems work